Thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm Jeffrey Levinson from the Department of Ecology and Evolution, who along with the Provost Office and of course Earthstock are sponsoring this event tonight. This is, I think, the last event of Earthstock, unless you count the opportunity that all of you have to go to the University Cafe, those of you who are of age, and have a beer and listen to Jack's Waterfall and hear some nice music. But don't go now, because you'll be missing something really wonderful. There are a couple of things we're going to do, one before, and then we have the event itself. We are going to announce today a competitive scholarship oriented toward environmental studies. This has been in existence for several years now. It has a very sad beginning because it began with the death of an undergraduate here. Jeffrey Ang died much too young, a really terrible event, but his family responded in a wonderful way, and they endowed a scholarship in Jeffrey's memory. And Jeff Barnett, who might be here, and I remember him, and he was a freshman here. This has allowed several students to get aid for their studies in any area related to environmental sciences. And it's a competitive scholarship. People apply, and consideration is given to their grades, to their experience and active work in environmental studies or environmental science, and finally, need. So those three factors together have contributed to our choice today. And I'm delighted, and I'm going to call her up to the stage, and I hope you'll give her a warm hand to announce that this is going to be presented this year to Adeline Manelli. So would Adeline come up? Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So
Thank you.
she gets that certificate, but there is some money to follow. And we're really delighted that she could continue her work. So now the main event. This is a lecture that we've had every year for many years now. Last year, we had a very exciting event. We had a teleconference live lecture from Ove Goldberg from Australia, from Queensland, and he gave a talk about the coral reef crisis, and it was just like he was here, although he was all the way in Australia. Today, I'm very happy to introduce our provost, Eric Kaler, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and it's really my very great pleasure to welcome you to this event as part of Earthstock and the next to last event of the week. I'm especially pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Carl Safina, who's a prominent ecologist and marine conservationist and also an adjunct professor in marine sciences at Stony Brook. Today I spent a great deal of time introducing SUNY's strategic plan, rolling out SUNY's strategic plan at a couple of events I watched other people rolled. But one of the things that we celebrated about SUNY was the strength of our alumni. SUNY has produced a very large number of distinguished alumni through the years, and I'm particularly proud to note that Dr. Safina is one of those. He received his bachelor's degree from the State University of New York at Purchase. He then went on to earn his doctorate from Rutgers University. He is the founder and president of the Blue Ocean Institute, which is an environmental organization based in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Dr. Safina is also a MacArthur Fellow and a recipient of the Pew Scholars Award in Conservation and the Environment. Dr. Safina was also named among the 100 notable conservationists of the 20th century by Audubon magazine. Carl has written or co-written several books, including his first one named Song for the Blue Ocean, which was chosen as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. His second book, Eye of the Albatross, was selected by the National Academies as the year's best book for communicating science. Finally, in recognition of his work to preserve marine populations, preserve and restore marine populations, Dr. Safina was just named a finalist for one of the most prestigious awards for animal conservation, the $100,000 Annapolis Prize. Throughout his career, Dr. Safina has worked tirelessly and brilliantly to call attention to the plight of marine and oceanic species and to initiate programs aimed at their conservation. Carl became a voice for the conservation and restoration of life in the sea, and he's helped to lead movements to ban high seas drift nets, to reform federal fishery laws, and to achieve passage of the United Nations Global Fisheries Treaty. We're very, very lucky to have Dr. Safina with us tonight, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming him to the microphone. Dr. Safina.
And there it goes, turned on. Thank you very much for coming. So we're going to talk a lot tonight about the ocean, but as you can see from the title of the talk, it has a lot to do with all of us being caught up together in a certain series of relationships. And we're going to travel around the ocean. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. It'll be a little bit of autobiography and a little science lecture, and then some other things. So first of all, although this is Earth Week, anybody from another planet coming here would probably have assumed that this planet would have been called Ocean, so it might have been Ocean Day and Ocean Week, because the chances are 3 out of 4 that your first impression of this planet will be nothing but water at the surface. And the ocean is a magic and mystical place. It seems to draw people, not only physically, but also our imagination. It's certainly drawn me for my whole life. I grew up here on Long Island, and the main thing about me is basically I'm a guy who likes to go fishing. That's really the only thing you really need to know about me. That's me on the left, and me in the middle at age 12, and then at age 15 there with my father. And by the time I got to be about 15 or 16 years old, I was faced with a terrible dilemma, which is that I seemed to be growing up. Now, when my father used to take me fishing, we would often go fishing on Long Island Sound, and we'd have to stop at the commuter train at the Syosset train station because we'd be going down there for the evening fishing, and these trains would be coming in, and I'd watch all these guys getting off the train, and they all seemed to wear the same suit, and they seemed to have the same briefcase, and they all looked equally exhausted, as though they had just been released to go to their sleeping quarters and then get up the next day and do it all over again. Now, you know, from the high hill of my current old age, I can say it's really not that bad, but when I was a teenager, it seemed terrifying. And it was not anything that I wanted to do. So I wanted to remain a kid and stay by these shallow coastal habitats that had really opened my heart. I had no idea how I was going to avoid growing up. Then I found out that there is a remarkable social institution called graduate school. Graduate school can prevent maturation in adulthood for your entire life if you do it well enough. And I highly recommend it to everyone. So in graduate school, what I did was I studied seabirds. I liked seabirds because seabirds led me to where the fish were. They were my buddies. And I went out on the ocean and I studied seabirds as ocean animals. How did they find those fish in that deep ocean? How did they know where they were? How could they keep track of them? What made the little fish available? Was it the big fish chasing them up from below? So that's what I did for my dissertation. And for quite a few years, instead of getting on the commuter train and going to a cubicle, this is what my office looked like, and this suited me a lot better. Now, it's just a personal thing. This suited me. Also, because I liked fishing, I started going farther and farther and encountering fish that I had only read about previously, like this one. This is a mako shark, and this one weighs over 200 pounds. That seems big, and it certainly at the time was really thrilling. It was the kind of fishing I never thought I would get to do. It was an animal I never thought I would get to see. I can still remember a lot about catching this individual fish very vividly. And it was just very exciting, and it tasted great. I'm not going to say it didn't. But, you know, sometimes when you start to learn a little bit about something, your impression of it changes. And sometimes your sense of the ethics of it changes depending on what you've learned. So what I started to learn was that mako sharks, if they are females, they don't start breeding until they're over 700 pounds. And if they're males, they don't breed until they're 300 pounds. And this big, dangerous animal that I had just subdued because I was such a great fisherman weighed a little over 200 pounds. In other words, it was a baby. It had never had a chance to reproduce. And so in that light, not really something to be terribly proud of. If you think of it as a solitary predator, like a seagoing version of a grizzly bear, then this is the moral equivalent of shooting a bear cub. Another thing that really thrilled me, probably more than anything else I ever did, was fishing for bluefin tuna. And I'm going to read you a little passage that goes pretty well with this image. Bluefin tuna are remarkable because they are one of the biggest fish in the sea. They are the warmest fish of a very small handful of fish that are warm-blooded. The bluefin is the warmest. That makes it the most alert. They can swim at highway speeds, and they can cross the ocean from the shores of one continent clear across to the shores of another. So one morning I was out in my boat about 30 miles south of Fire Island, and nothing at all was happening for a while, and it was very calm. And then what caught my eye was a faint chevron bulging ever so slightly from that molten glassy sea, 50 yards from where I sat drifting. As I rose to my feet to study it, the chevron grew to a wake, but a wake without a boat, and then the wake accelerated and exploded like a revelation. A giant bluefin tuna, among the largest and most magnificent of animals, hung suspended for a long, riveting moment, emblazoned and backlit like a saber-finned warrior from another world, until its 600 pounds of muscle crashed into the ocean like a boulder falling from the sky. That morning, I saw something, not new exactly, I had seen tuna before, but I saw something differently. I saw this fish not as a struggling opponent at the end of my line or a prop for my sport or as dollars at the dock, but instead I saw it as a wild animal, the perfect master of its element, no less spectacular than any bear or lion or eagle. No less spectacular, but perhaps even more venerable. In a world older and more complete than ours, Henry Beston wrote in The Outermost House, they move finished and complete. The bluefin tuna is clearly complete. Some say it is nearly finished. Scientists calculate that its population off the east coast of the US and Canada has plummeted 90%. They say that reproduction is now failing. But commercial fishermen, good fishermen and good people say that that's hogwash, that the fish are abundant, maybe even increasing, that they've just changed their migration routes. That debate is more than academic because an adult bluefin may be worth more money to the person who can kill one than any other animal on the planet, elephants and rhinos included. Probing for the truth to this debate requires following the bluefin, and its trail leads us in many directions. But most of all, it leads through the looking glass of the ocean surface, revealing that while the ocean may look the same as it has for millennia, it has changed, and changed greatly. So they don't call them giant tuna for nothing, and this is not even a particularly big one. They get to be twice this size. They have caught the imagination of people literally for thousands of years, and literally since the time of the Greeks, there were traps in the Mediterranean designed just to catch bluefin tuna as they were migrating near the shore. A very few of these traps are still barely operating. Many have gone out of business in the last decade for lack of fish. But just to give you an idea of the ability of this fish to get on people's minds, somebody just last week when I gave a lecture out at Stanford, they presented me with a Roman coin from 200 BC, stamped on one side with the head of a god, and on the other side with 2 bluefin tuna. They've also gotten on the minds of more than a few writers and artists, like my friend Salvador Dali here. His interpretation of the scene is that everybody has their clothes off, but if you look back at the original, they all have their clothes on. Artistic license. Here's another picture of the same scene, which is that we've taken this warm-blooded, ocean-crossing, highway speed swimming, magnificent, giant animal, and bite by bite, we demolished them. They are still around. The fishing for them is generally terrible because they are very, very depleted right now. It went from being a thing that was thrilling to a thing that's just really sad and usually completely unsuccessful. So I haven't bothered to fish for them in years, actually. They still show up at times, sometimes dense crowds of them for a short period of time, and then they're gone. In the East Atlantic, they are really plummeting in numbers. They were just proposed for a total ban on trade at the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and that proposal was destroyed, really, by Japan, who got lots of poor countries to vote against it in exchange for gifts and aid and things like that. So one thing I noticed when I was young was that the fishing generally seemed to be getting worse, not better, and I wanted to know why that was, and I started looking around and finding that the scale of what we do in the ocean is really enormous. It kind of matches the scale of the ocean itself. Here in this net, there are 20 tons of a fish called orange roughy. Probably the older people here remember seeing orange roughy on the menu a lot in the early 1990s, and now you don't see it anymore. And I'll tell you why. Because these fish don't start breeding until they're 30 years old. They live very deep and they live very long. They can live probably to about 150 years of age, and in that 20-ton pull, there are probably a lot of fish that are 100 years old, and they're not coming back 2 weeks from now. Those fish are gone. So basically, the reason we don't see that on the menu is because we ate most of them. When people go fishing, they always catch stuff that they're not intending to catch. It makes up a lot of what is caught in the world. And if you look at what's on the deck here, that shark and all those other fish, it would be hard for people to guess what he is fishing for. Probably a few people here could guess. Who knows, who thinks they know what he's fishing for? Just yell it out if you think. Shrimp. Yes, he is fishing for shrimp. And look, he caught one. Oh, he caught 2. These guys put the shrimp in the baskets, then they take the broom and they shovel it out the hole in the side of the boat. That's shrimp fishing. The amazing thing about this is that this is in South Carolina, and this is about the cleanest shrimp fishing in the world because he is required to have large mesh panels in the side of the net that, believe it or not, let most of the fish out. In a lot of the world, it's a lot worse than this. I counted them. On the second tow, I think I counted that there were something like 80 fish per shrimp. Also, we do this charming thing where we have methods of fishing that destroy the habitat as they are used. So it would be like going deer hunting with bulldozers, which you would probably run over a few deer, but you can't come back to the same place too many times in a row and do that. These are not bizarre kinds of methods only used by 1 or 2 crazy people. These are standard methods in certain parts of the world. Blowing up the reef to stun the fish and poisoning the reef to stun the fish, which in both cases leaves you with a dead reef. So over the course of my lifetime, I often say I was born too late for everything that I really would have liked, you know, like the heyday of sword fishing and the jazz era and stuff like that. And it seems like on the day my mother brought me home from the hospital, which was right about here, the world's fisheries started crashing. It wasn't my fault. I don't know why that happened, but that's just timing, luck and timing. In the 1950s, there were basically no fisheries considered overexploited or crashed at the beginning of that decade. over 80% of the world fisheries considered underexploited. I remember learning in 4th grade that there were so many fish along the coasts that imagine how many we're going to get when we start fishing out in the middle of the ocean. Of course, there are actually not that many fish out in the middle of the ocean compared to the coasts. So what we didn't realize was we were already very heavily into where there were the most fish. And now we have about 2/3 of the fisheries in the world either crashed, meaning the catch has declined 90% or more, or overexploited, meaning they're being taken out faster than they can reproduce and the fish are going downhill. You look at the ocean, you say, it's so big, how could we affect what's out there? But if you look at the rate of decline, it's well within the envelope of decline for all the other kinds of major habitats. So people have become a true force of nature. And in fact, geologists have been having a bit of a friendly debate for about a decade over whether to rename our time. Our time has been called the Holocene, the last 20,000 years or so, and there are some people who say that now humans are such a dominant force on the surface of the planet that we should rename this time the Anthropocene, the time of people. Basically, in short, the story of the ocean is it once had a lot of fish and a lot of them were big. It has far fewer and most of them are much smaller. And the complexity of the seafloor and the continental shelves has been simplified by running nets back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. By the way, I see some people here standing or sitting on the floor. Would you like to have a seat? And if so, I'll just stop for a moment. You can get settled. Okay. Now, the first oil wells were actually whales, and the first drills were harpoons. And we don't seem to have learned very much about oil since that time. Those people were thinking only of themselves. They weren't thinking that they needed to leave a few whales for us. They killed almost all of them in a lot of the oceans of the world. And not in the time of Moby Dick. You can see this is a color photograph. Most of the whales that were killed in the 20th century. And many of them, the big whales, can live close to a century. Many of those individual whales would still be swimming around today. Certainly, their babies, like this humpback whale fetus, would be swimming around today. When we take what we see we're taking, we also take all of the productivity that would have flowed from that thing. Or we basically borrow from the future. We take from the future. And I think this is a sort of a dramatic image. This spiny dogfish, which is pregnant for longer than any other animal in the world. They're pregnant for 2 years, and she's just died in this gill net and is literally giving birth right here. There's one emerging and one just born. So that leads us back to Salvador and our other really big problem, which is we simply have forgotten what the world is supposed to look like. Our sense of time has been skewed, and if we don't know how much we've lost, we can't really have an intelligent discussion about what we should try to get back to, or what direction we're heading, or even gauging how much we've changed things. And this is not just about saving coral reefs or saving little fish from getting shoveled overboard. A lot of it really is about the fact that when all those little fish get caught in that net, a lot of people get caught in that net as well. And what goes around comes around. And the effects come back to people, mostly to people who don't have a lot of options. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't use nature or go fishing or any of that stuff. We just shouldn't destroy it. And for the last 15 years or so, I've mainly been working on these books that are mostly about how the ocean is changing and what the changes mean for wildlife and for people. I consider myself to be unbelievably lucky that I can do this, and I get to go out in the field with people who are the experts in their area and they may have spent 20 years learning about a system, learning what's going on. In a few days, they tell me everything that they've learned in all these decades. I get to go to these incredible places, and then really it's my job to portray that in an accurate way so that I can take everybody who wants to come along for the trip along with me. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I've chosen as traveling companions a couple of really remarkable kinds of animals, like these leatherback sea turtles, which, by the way, visit Long Island waters in the summertime. I've seen a few of them here. They can weigh up to 800 pounds. And also albatrosses. As I mentioned earlier, I really love seabirds. And I wrote a book about albatrosses as well. But really, the books are about what's going on in the ocean, because a turtle that can cross the entire ocean, an albatross that can fly across the entire ocean, a tuna that can swim across the entire ocean, they feel everything people are doing to the sea. So they make very informative traveling companions. The other thing about albatrosses is I think they're spectacularly beautiful. Some of them look like they were designed in the Art Deco era. And some of them have the longest wings in nature, 11.5 feet, tip to tip. That is big. I think I'll read you a little short passage about albatrosses from that book. The immense creatures we call albatross are the greatest long-distance wanderers on Earth. Big birds in big oceans, albatrosses lead big, sprawling lives across space and time, traveling to the limits of seemingly limitless seas. They accomplish these distances by wielding the body architecture of creatures built to glide indefinitely. An albatross is a great symphony of flesh, perception, bone, and feathers, composed of long movements and set to ever-changing rhythms of light, wind, and water. It drifts in the atmosphere at high speed, but itself remains immobile, an immense bird holding stock still, yet shooting through the wind. Just as individual notes become music by relationship to other notes, the bird's stillness becomes movement by context. Following your traveling ship with ease, watching you, circling stern to prow and back at will, it flies with scarcely a flinch, skimming wave upon wave, mile after mile after mile. Watching it, you invariably wonder, how can it do that? So as I said, they're big. They're really big. I used to have a hard time believing that birds evolved from dinosaurs until I spent some time with these things. They also get caught accidentally in fishing gear. And they're another long-lived animal. They need to live about 50 years to complete their full lifespan and produce enough offspring to keep the population stable. And they wander around an ocean that has a lot of fishing gear and plenty of opportunities for them to get into trouble. And they are the most endangered group of birds. When I was working on that book, there were 13 species, and now there are 23 species. And that is not because evolution happens that quickly or I write that slowly. It's that in that time that I was writing my book, there were a group of people working on the genetics of albatrosses that looked very similar from different distant islands, and they found that they, in fact, had been isolated and separated so long that the genetic differences were enough to consider them separate species. So they're kind of like Darwin's finches writ really large. Now, the way they get in trouble is they go behind a fishing boat that is letting a line out the back that is like a 25-mile long line with thousands of baited hooks on it. And here's the line going out the back of a boat right here. And there's a hook every few feet with bait, and the birds usually are in here trying to pull the bait off before the line sinks. They can't dive very, very much, so they have to get it while it's near the surface. You'll notice on this boat, there are a couple of thousand albatrosses, but this whole zone here doesn't have any birds. That's because there's a piece of rope here, and a splashing buoy, and some streamers, and a piece of rope here, and some streamers, and the albatrosses are afraid of that stuff. Where they fly, there is nothing in the air, and they don't want to go near it. So a problem that was killing so many albatrosses that in a lot of islands, the big populations were really declining, and people were worried that they were going to go extinct. This problem is solved with 2 pieces of rope. When I was working on my book, people were wringing their hands. All the albatross scientists, the conservation groups, there are billions of hooks in the ocean. There are tens of thousands of boats. The albatrosses need to live for years. They're running to the same places. What will ever happen? How can we ever accomplish something to do? Well, 2 pieces of rope. As soon as it goes out the back of the boat, the rate of albatross mortality goes down about 98%. And this is now required in the waters from Hawaii to Alaska, off British Columbia, off New Zealand, Australia, much of the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic, and the entire Southern Ocean. It's now mandatory to trail a couple of pieces of rope behind the boat and make a few other little fixes that save these birds. The biggest thing that killed adult sea turtles was shrimp nets. They would drown in shrimp nets at a really high rate, and for 20 years, conservationists and fishermen in the US fought and screamed at each other about whether to do this, which is basically you put a barbecue grill in a shrimp net and you cut a little flap, and when the turtle hits the grate, it just slides out the flap and the problem is solved. After 20 years of bitter fighting, now the fishermen are forced to do this, they're required to do this, and what they've said to me is now they like this and they would use it anyway, even if there were no turtles, because it also keeps out stuff like boulders and pieces of sodden driftwood and things like that that mash up their catch. So now they like it. But problem solved with a barbecue grill in the net. But these are not the only problems, because we also, of course, put all kinds of stuff out there. We pollute the ocean. We even pollute the ocean with things that are called nutrients. Well, nutrients are very nice. They make things grow. But it's always a matter of too much of a good thing. A lot of time that is the definition of pollution. Like a glass of wine is a good thing, 6 glasses of wine is pollution. And these pollutants accumulate, and there are people who still live really, really at the top of the food chain. Some of those people are US citizens, like these Inuit people in Alaska. And, you know, her husband came home with 2 seals. Here's a little toy truck. That's what they eat. That's still part of their diet. This woman in a modern kitchen, she's taken a piece of whale out of the refrigerator and is cutting it up for a snack for a guest from out of town. Those things have been accumulating all this toxic stuff. They eat the toxic accumulators, and then they have problems. Problems that they did not cause, but what goes around does come back, and it's not their fault, but they do suffer from it. Again, you look at the ocean and you say, it's so big. How could we possibly pollute the ocean? And, you know, the atmosphere, you hear all this stuff about, oh, climate change and Al Gore and all this stuff. How could we possibly pollute the atmosphere? Well, it turns out that this is all the water on Earth. This is all the air on Earth. We live on a bubble, a marble, let's say. We live on a marble with 2 coats of shellac, 1 wet coat and 1 little wisp of gas. That's where we live. So now we have this other big problem, which is that we are making the climate warmer, and that's a big problem. Physicists told us for a long time that the reason that the Earth is warm enough for living things is because of something called the greenhouse effect. And it's carbon dioxide and a few other gases that trap heat, like a greenhouse, keeps the Earth warm enough for living things, but too much of a good thing. Since the Industrial Revolution, all the coal we burn, all the oil we burn, all that carbon dioxide increases the greenhouse effect, and it warms the place a little bit. The carbon dioxide in that little wisp of atmosphere is enough to make a difference. especially since the Industrial Revolution, but since the 1950s it's been measured, and you can see that it has gone inexorably up, but it goes up and down and up and down and up and down every year because the measurements are sensitive enough to detect that when it's summer in the northern hemisphere and the trees are taking in the carbon dioxide, it actually goes down. But we keep doing it 12 months out of the year, so the trend is upward, quite a bit upward. About a third more carbon dioxide now than about 200 years ago. That's a staggering change to the makeup of the atmosphere. And it is warming the atmosphere, but it's also, a lot of that is warming the ocean, and a lot of the heat is now being taken up by the ocean. The world would be a lot warmer if it wasn't for that part. The polar regions are warming fastest, and that's affecting entire ecosystems in the northern polar region, the southern polar region. Like here in the south, these little krill, these little shrimp-like things called krill, are what basically all the vertebrates depend very heavily on. All the penguins, the whales, and the seals. And the krill, for a little tiny thing, they live a long time. They live about 7 years. And for 2 or 3 years, they eat by grazing the algae off the underside of ice, which is what that thing is doing. If the ice shrinks about 10%, they lose 10% of their food. There are about 10% fewer of them, just to oversimplify. And in fact, penguin populations are feeling the pain now. Young penguins are not surviving as well. Penguin populations are generally declining as a result of the loss of ice. You would think that the coral reefs would be enjoying the warmth because they only grow in warm water, but too much of a good thing. These heat spikes every few years cause the algae that lives in the coral and gives it these nice blue and green colors to leave the coral. The algae make the food that the coral lives on. They create the sugar that the coral lives on. And if the algae leave, the coral have nothing to eat. And if the algae are gone a little too long, like a few weeks, the corals starve and die. And this has happened over some large areas. If the reef dies, it can't provide food for people. It can't provide protection for coastlines where millions of people live. It cannot provide all the things that we think are there that we haven't even discovered yet. Not only is the ocean getting warmer, but carbon dioxide is dissolving into the ocean, and that creates an acid so that the ocean is getting more acidic. That has some effects that are a little surprising. If you take the pH of the ocean from where it is now, 8.1, and you move it to 7.9, sea urchin larvae don't grow right. If you move it to 7.7 in a laboratory, sea urchin larvae get deformed and die. If you take little clams that live in seawater that's now 8.1 pH and you put them in water of 7.5, they dissolve in about 3 days. And in fact, on the west coast, there are already oyster hatcheries where when the currents shift and they get a little plume of water with a drop in pH, it's wiping out all their larvae. And that has never happened before. We have heard a lot about the polar bear and how polar bears are endangered because the ice is melting. And the reason that is that there is one kind of seal in the Arctic called the ringed seal that can live anywhere that there is sea ice because they make holes in the ice where they can breathe, and the polar bears wait at those holes, and that's how they hunt. If they don't have ice, they can't hunt. You think that maybe that would be good for the seals at least, but the seals then have no place to give birth. So we hear a lot about polar bears, but we don't hear about all the other animals that are doomed without ice. These things all need ice, including the little harp seals here, the subject of that hunt that is so controversial. Actually, they're having a harder time now with ice melting in the breeding areas than they are with the hunters. There are also ice-dependent animals on 2 legs living up in the Arctic, like these Eskimos. These guys live in Alaska. They are American citizens. They were certainly here before America. And They live on a barrier beach in this village. They claim that they've occupied this particular beach for several thousand years, and they certainly have been there at least hundreds of years, because the inlets on each side of the island give them perfect access to really good hunting in the ocean and also access across the bay to hunting and foraging areas up on the mainland. So it's a perfect spot, and they've lived there for hundreds of years. There are 600 people living there. They have a problem now, though. In the winter, the ocean, this is the island, this is the bay, the mainland is up here. The ocean used to freeze in the fall. It doesn't freeze anymore. It used to freeze, and then these storms would blow with hurricane force winds in the early winter. But the frozen ocean would armor the coast, so it was okay. Now it's not okay. There's no ice. So those storms come, they take as much as 50 feet of land in one storm. And this is the mayor of the town right on the front line here explaining to me that when he was a kid, there were 3 rows of sand dunes going out seaward. The ocean was about half a mile farther away. And recently, 16 houses here got swept away in a big storm. There are the remains of one of them that got knocked down, was still lying on the beach there. Now, they didn't cause this problem, and their solution is they need to move across the bay. And everybody says, well, that place across the bay that you want to move to, you've been hunting there for hundreds of years and nobody lives there, so fine, go and move. You can have it, no problem. The only thing is that they need about $100 million to move and build their houses and rebuild the school and make a few roads and a landing strip and a power plant. They have no idea where they're going to get $100 million from. And they didn't cause the problem, but nobody's stepping forward to bail them out. So they're pretty terrified. They don't know what the future will hold. They're afraid that the community will just be scattered. They'll all be refugees. They don't know how to really live in cities. They're really afraid for their kids. So if 600 American citizens cannot move 10 miles to land that no one contests, what will happen when 10 million people in Bangladesh have to move 5 miles inland because their farms are getting salt water on them and their wells are getting contaminated with rising seawater? Those people are not going to be greeted with open arms by other people who are barely making it as it is. So these are not just problems about polar bears or seals. These are problems that have to do with real conflict, very expensive conflict, and things that we will not be able to avoid getting drawn into and swept into. Even in the tropics, there are people who depend utterly on ice in the polar regions. And as the sea level is coming up, they're noticing things they never saw before. About 10 years ago, these people started seeing that when the moon was new and full and the tide was a little higher, it came right up onto the land. They had never seen that before. And I had dinner with them in their own backyard in knee-deep water with tropical fish swimming around my feet. And they don't know what they're going to do. Nobody's coming and saying, we'll pay you out to go and build another house someplace. There are not like 30 people who have this problem. There are a few 100,000 people living in the Pacific on very low islands that have this problem. And people have suggested, well, maybe you could go to a really nice country like New Zealand, or maybe you could go to Australia. Well, what if somebody came here and said to you, maybe you can go to a nice country like New Zealand. Why don't you just move to New Zealand? That should solve your problems. They like that idea just about as much as you would. The other thing is that heat really hurts crops. At 105 degrees Fahrenheit nighttime temperature, rice fails. So there is really a lot at stake. And it's a lot at stake mostly for people who have no options, no ability to really manipulate their situation. This guy is Aldo Leopold. He wrote a seminal book in conservation called A Sand County Almanac. It's a really famous book, and he came out with a thing called The Land Ethic, the culminating essay in that book, in which he says that the human community is not just people. No one had ever had that thought before. I actually think it's one of the most revolutionary thoughts in the entire history of philosophy. The human community is not just humans. It's people and the land, what he called the land. And what he meant by the land was the entire physical community that supports life. Everybody tends to think that we are separate from the world and we can move around and we're sort of independent of things. But what we are really is we're an interchange. Without water flowing through us, without food flowing through us, and without air flowing in and out, we die really fast. Try holding your breath for 5 minutes and you will see how connected to the rest of the world you really are. If you unplug from that flow, you're finished very rapidly. So he was a scientist. He was mainly a forester and a land manager, and he understood that this community idea is a basic concept in ecology, but he also went farther and he said that this created an ethical and a moral implication. And yet, scientists are trained not to wander into the boundaries of morality and ethics. Just present the data from your work and then politely leave the room. And what scientists are told, mostly by other scientists, is that the expert policymakers will then make the wise decision. Of course, this cannot be further from the truth, because what happens is that all the special interests are really pushing on the policymakers. Many of the policymakers represented the special interests in their last job. And without anybody really advocating for the scientific facts, the facts get lost in the debate. So you cannot make a wise choice if you don't know the facts, and if you choose to ignore the facts, or your job depends on making sure you don't understand the facts. So scientists forfeit the moral power of knowledge. And that has led, I think, to some really catastrophic decision-making. A thing about science that makes it really unique is that science is the only thing ever devised that is trying to get at the truth. There is nothing else like that. If you take, let's say you have a half dozen or so scientists, and some of them are men and some are women, and some are one from each race, let's say, and one from each religion, and everything they think about the world is kind of different. They have their own take on it. And you give them an experiment to do, and they all do it the same way. Guess what? They get the same answer. There is nothing like that. Certainly, law doesn't try to get at the truth. In fact, many lawyers will tell you that to be a good lawyer, whatever that would mean in this context, you need to ignore the truth sometimes. Religion doesn't try to get at the truth. Sports doesn't try to get at the truth. But science does, and that makes science really the most important discipline, I think, in society in that way. The only real exception to this is that the climate scientists have not been afraid to really get involved in the implications of what should be done. So this guy, Kerry Emanuel, he wrote a paper that appeared in Science a month before Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans, and that paper said, according to my calculations, it looks like we will not be getting more hurricanes as the air warms up, but the hurricanes we do get are likely to include some really strong ones. And, there were a lot of people who were trying to blow holes in what he had to say, but he didn't shrink away from it, and he believes that scientists do have a moral obligation to tell people what they're finding. But a problem is that the rest of the society doesn't really look to scientists for moral guidance. They mainly look to religious leaders, and the religious community unlike scientists, have tried to be very influential and have succeeded. But generally, faith groups think that matters of the environment and conservation are not matters of faith and spirituality, that spirituality has to do with the other world, not really this one. The other thing is that a lot of scientists and a lot of conservationists tend to be liberal about a lot of things, and they make people who are not liberal uncomfortable. So I think that this is a big problem, and I think that we need to start to bridge these gaps, because the gaps have cost us a lot. And I had an idea that we should talk to the religious community. So this is me in this boat. One of the things that we did was we went to Alaska to look at the current things that were going on with climate change with some scientific leaders and some religious leaders. In this boat, he is the head of the National Association of Evangelicals. He is the head of the National Association for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was the Vice President for Policy for the National Association of Evangelicals. And he told Ronald Reagan to make a speech to the evangelicals about the evil empire of the Soviet Union and their nuclear menace. And as a result of that, he started a thing called the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, for which he won a Nobel Prize. He and he hated each other in the early 1980s. Now you could see that it's really impossible to tell the religious people from the science people by looking at them, because in fact we are all more or less the same. An interesting thing is that this guy here, he runs several mega churches, and when he started saying that he thought that humans changing the climate was really in fact a matter of religious concern, he started several letter campaigns to get thousands of letters written to him telling him to fire him. But he said, no, I think he's right. Now that's a happy story with a happy ending, but there is a coda to that. And the coda is that a few months after this trip, his name is Richard Cizik, he was on Fresh Air with Terry Gross on NPR. I'm sure everybody's heard that show. And he said the following. He said, not really representing my evangelical organization, but my personal thought is that, there might be worse things, maybe more important things to worry about than the idea of two people of the same sex living together. That was too much. That was the last straw, and finally, something had to give, and he got fired for that. Not very Christian of his constituency, if you ask me. But what we said on the boat was that we have a moral obligation, religious or scientific, we have a moral obligation to not destroy the world. Okay, that has to count as progress. It really shouldn't take thousands of years for us to decide that we all have an interest in not seeing our own boat sink out from under us. But it has to count as progress. Now, getting back to these people here, they live on an island called Pemba off the coast of Tanzania. And as you can see, there are a lot of them, and they are what we would call very, very poor. And in fact, they don't have much wiggle room in their life. And they have problems. They have little farms, lots and lots of people. The coral reefs are really stressed. They rely very heavily on fishing. Their fish catches are not very impressive. So totally independently, completely independently of the thing that we were doing with the American religious community, their own religious community was suddenly awakening to the idea that taking care of the reefs and taking care of the land was a matter of religious concern. And they were finding things in the Quran that said so. Like, if you cut a tree, you must plant a tree. So they had cut a lot of the mangroves for fuel and for building homes. And they were noticing that, it was a problem with the storms. They learned that the little fish that live out on the reef as adults live in the mangroves as juveniles. They could see that there was something wrong with the fishing. And so there it was in the Quran, lo and behold, if you cut a tree, you must plant a tree. And they said, all right, well, let's go do that. So we went out and we planted some trees. So these problems are really bigger than ideologies, and they really do require us to get our heads and our acts together and get with the program, you might say. And getting back to my friends, the albatrosses. The albatrosses are very instructive in a variety of ways, I think. They teach us, for instance, that on this planet, we are not the only creatures who care about each other. We are not the only creatures who care about our children. In fact, albatrosses care about their children more than any other animals on the planet, I would say, except maybe some people. What they do to raise their young is absolutely extraordinary. This is a map of the entire North Pacific Ocean. Here are the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, Canada, California, Hawaii, the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. Russia is over here. That's the whole North Pacific. And this bird that I named Amelia, she has a chick in a nest on this atoll. This is a real bird with a real satellite transmitter, and that's a real track. While her chick waits in the nest, she goes on a trip for a month, March 16th to April 14th. First, she flies straight north until she hits the boundary of the North Pacific Current. And where that water slows against the subarctic water, she starts looking for food. She finds food here. You can see she's looping around here for a couple of days. Then she breaks that off, goes all along the edge, finds some food here, dips down, finds a lot of food here for a couple of 100 miles, comes back along the edge, just makes a right turn, and goes about 1,500 miles straight to an island that is half a mile wide. We think we're better than them. But they have senses we completely lack. Our big thing is we're supposed to have the brain that we have, and that is the thing that's supposed to make us special. But these islands here, they're all owned by the United States, so she's an American citizen. She returns note on April 14th, files her taxes, feeds her chick, and takes off again. So after that trip was about 9,000 miles for a month, and her mate is doing the same thing. So the chick may wait 2 weeks for a meal. She comes and she feeds this chick for 10 minutes. She doesn't lie around, she doesn't take a vacation, she just leaves, and you watch them and they just get narrower and littler, and then they just vanish. They are literally passing life from one generation to the next in this unbroken chain of being, and I think that if anything can be called sacred, if a book could be called sacred even though you can print more, if a building can be called sacred even though you could make more anytime you want, then passing life from one generation to the next is certainly sacred. And into their holy place, holy crap, this is the middle of the ocean. And that's where we are by proxy, with all of our junk. This is not all fishing stuff. A lot of this is household stuff. A lot of it is bottles, all kinds of plastic, toy dinosaurs, baby dolls, toothbrushes. What else did I find? I found welcome mats, umbrellas. I even found a bowling ball. I guess bowling balls can float in the Pacific. Much as I love albatrosses, they are not incredibly smart about what they eat. And there's a lot of plastic floating where they eat. They eat a lot of the plastic. I think they eat it because it has gooseneck barnacles growing on it and fish eggs stuck to it a lot of the time. And in nature, they do eat floating pumice and little pieces of wood, and they can spit those things up. They're totally benign. It's like eating a cherry and spitting out the pit. But plastic is different. Plastic has chemicals in it that leach out. Plastic can break into sharp pieces. All of the chicks have plastic in them. This is a chick that's about 6 months old. All of that parental devotion has gone into it. It's ready to fly, and it has died, and it is packed with cigarette lighters. This bird in the middle of the ocean was packed with cigarette lighters. Well, that is not the relationship with the world that we are supposed to have. And that is not the relationship that probably any of us would want to have, but it is literally the relationship that we do have with these birds and the rest of the world. And why is that? Because with our big brains, we simply don't even think about it. So we seem to be caught in a variety of really big problems here, and what can we do about that? Well, we have an interesting history. And throughout our history, people have devised ways of doing things better and doing things differently. In a very narrow sense, speaking just about the ocean, which is mainly what we're emphasizing tonight, our main effect on the ocean is with the seafood that we eat and the fishing that we commission by doing that. And now there's a lot of information about sustainable seafood. We put out a lot of this. We actually were the first ones to do it, and you can get seafood guides out on the back table. You can text your fish. If you're interested in knowing if striped bass is good to eat, you type the word fish, and whatever it is you're interested, fish, striped bass, fish, clams, fish, salmon, you send that text to 30644, and in 10 seconds you get a little guidance back. So there's information out there. The other big thing is that people say, well, you know, what is warming the world? What's changing the ocean's chemistry? It's fossil fuels. But getting off of fossil fuels is too expensive. The thing about it is that the alternative energy, which would be things like geothermal and sun and wind and tidal, that energy is actually free once you construct the thing that can tap it, and it's eternal, and it's clean. The big difference is, ever since we were living in caves, every time we needed a little energy, we set fire to something, and we are still doing exactly the same thing. That's what it means to burn oil and burn coal. We set fire to it to get energy. Ever since we've lived in caves, we've been doing the same thing. It's time for a new energy basis to our civilization, and the sources are out there. The surface of the Earth has 50,000 times the amount of energy that humans currently use. And backward countries like the Philippines get 25% of their electricity already from geothermal energy. So there are all these alternatives, and we're told that free energy is too expensive. Who tells us that? Oil companies. Coal companies. Why is it too expensive? Because the price of all the health problems, the price of moving millions of people around when the sea comes up, the price of clashes between people and warfare and defending oil with blood is not what you pay at the pump. So of course it's cheap because the price is completely wrong. The price does not include all the costs. You pay the costs with taxes, with your health insurance, and with the blood of your children. That's how you pay it. So of course it's cheap. So they say that clean energy is too expensive. Where have we heard before that the energy we use to run our society is the cheap energy we have to keep, and doing it different is too expensive? Where have we heard that before? Well, it turns out that the cheapest energy is slaves. Now, we've crossed this bridge before. Energy, it turns out, is always a moral issue. Enslave people or wipe out the whales or destroy the atmosphere, it's always a matter of the morality that one learns when one starts to learn the facts. So we need to really support the creation of a green economy. Even if we had no global warming, we're getting left behind by China, getting left behind by Germany. We pay these petro-dictators, people who disdain us, for energy. There are all kinds of reasons, even if it wasn't causing any environmental problems, there are all kinds of reasons to just kick that and do something a lot better. And it turns out that every time our thinking gets a little bigger, every time we consider more about the ethics of what we're doing, every time we think a little less about just us, it turns out to be the right decision in the end, looking back on it. For instance, it used to be that only white men could own property. And then, slowly, after people yelled and fought and killed each other, it was like, all right, maybe black men, but let's make sure women can't vote. All right, we'll let women vote. They seem to really want to vote. Look how angry they all are. But we never look back and say, oops, that was a big mistake. We usually say, wow, people really killed each other over things like that? How did we do that? Now we have this other really strange problem right now. We're having this big debate about gay people and gay people in the military. What in the world are people afraid of? Are they afraid there's going to be sexual tension in the army? There are already women in the armed forces, so what in the world are they afraid of? And as far as homosexuality being a threat to marriage, I don't see gay people beating up their spouses. I'm not afraid that at night, when my 17-year-old daughter is walking home from work, that a gay person might see her in the dark. I'm not afraid of that. So I don't get what this is all about either. But people are yelling and screaming, and when we get past this, one generation from now, people will look back and say, wow, what was all of that about? But that'll bring us to really the next big threshold. And the next big threshold is that the way that we live, we are borrowing the future from our own children and from the people who will come next. We are dictating the terms of that loan. They can't be in the hearings, they can't come and write to their congressman, they can't have a say. We are narrowing their options and dictating the terms. So, I think the next big thing will be that we will really have to realize that there are other people involved that we really should think about. And I've heard people say, well, this was before we realized that a lot of the problems with climate change were really starting to happen in real time, when it was still a lot hypothetical. People saying, well, in 50 years the Arctic will start melting. In 100 years, maybe a problem with the coral reefs. In 200 years, we may have a really big problem with coastal erosion. And I've heard people really scoff, really scornful about the idea of thinking about people 200 years into the future. And yet every single day, we argue about the intentions of people 200 years in our past who wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. What was their intent? What were they thinking? What does it mean for us? Every day, we run our lives and we depend on the thoughtfulness of people 200 years ago. They didn't say, look at this country, you know what? Screw it, let's make a lot of money. They said, let's make the best country that has ever appeared on the face of the earth. And every day we thank them for that. But we don't act the same way. Why can't we aspire to be the best that we can be? Why can't we aspire to continue to have the greatest country ever on the face of the earth? Why do we act like teenagers who don't really appreciate what we have? Why can't we be as good as people who had no running water, no electricity, and went to relieve themselves out in outhouses, but were really a lot more high-minded in many ways than we seem to be? Why can't we be as good as them? Why can't we think about what will happen to people, our own children, and another few generations from now? I think we should, and I think that we could. So as I said in the beginning, I'm just a guy who likes to go fishing, and I've seen some things that were really bad get a lot better. like the striped bass that I really love to fish for and I love to eat. In the early 80s, people were talking about putting them on the endangered species list because they were so depleted. And by the end of the 90s, they were declared fully recovered because after a lot of yelling and fighting, people decided to protect them until they got big enough to lay eggs and to cut the catch rate enough so that enough would survive to, guess what, lay eggs. Not really terribly complicated. I actually think that most of the problems that we need to fix are not conceptually difficult. And I think that we could put a lot of things back to where they kind of should go. So I think if people stopped hating each other because of ideology, if we realize that we can't keep growing people and growing the economy on a planet that is not growing, and if we changed from cave-style energy to clean, eternal energy, I think we might be okay. And I think that that is conceptually simple, but I think it will be very, very, very difficult to actually do. And I think it will require a lot of high-mindedness and a lot of effort and a lot of thought. So one thing about this country that is really amazing is that compared to most countries in the world, every individual here has an awful, awful lot of power. And almost everybody doesn't use it at all. We complain about people who are on TV and they're yelling and talking and they're saying things we don't like, and we say that they have all the power. Those people are just individuals, just like every individual is. They learned, though, that if they speak up, they get a little attention. And it's good if everybody learns that. There's that famous line in the poem, The Second Coming, where it says, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." And often I feel that that's what I'm seeing around me. And we have all of this ability now to get on the web and reply to blogs and talk and write letters to the editor and all this kind of stuff that we can do, get involved volunteering or whatever. And a lot of us just don't really do it. We're kind of sitting it out at a really important time. And some people say, you know, well, I can't really make a difference. Well, and I say, well, don't worry about how big a difference you make. Everybody can make a little difference. Don't worry about being perfect. Just try to do things a little better than you're doing them now. So I hope that you will stay in touch with me, and I thank you very much for being here tonight, sharing the evening with me at the close of Ocean Week here. And I want to leave you with this image from Midway Atoll, these fairy terns, which to me look like the gates of heaven itself. These birds are really, really unbelievable because they do come just like that and hover right in your face and look in your eyes and make these little calls that sound like these strange little electronic voices. And they're very ethereal and very kind of spiritual. So I often look at this and I say some people might like to have this be the last thing they see before they close their eyes for the last time. Some people might like it to be the first thing they see after they close their eyes for the last time. But the point is that right now we're all here together, and what we do really matters. And I think it's really important for all of us to stay very hopeful. Hope motivates all work and all efforts because hope is the belief things can get better. And inspiration is the urge to act. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I hope that we all remain hopeful and we all stay inspired. And I want to thank you very much for having me here. And I guess I can take a few questions. So thanks very much.
I'm going to beg you to let me give you the microphone first so you can be recorded. We're videotaping this. It's going to be made put online, made into a DVD, and we really want those of you who have comments to be heard on it. So anybody have any questions or comments? And if you have a comment or a question, if you moved to the aisle, that would help us a lot.
Dr. Safina, what about the plankton? Could you comment about the very bottom of the food pyramid, food chain, about the situation and the condition of the ocean's plankton?
Yeah, well, it's true. The plankton are, of course, the very first rung on a long food chain in the ocean. And there are a variety of problems. A lot of the plankton make these little shells that also will dissolve if the water gets too acidic or will become deformed. So plankton communities are starting to really shift from ones that were the most abundant to others that were formerly not very abundant. It remains to be seen if that shift is okay or really a problem. A lot of the plankton communities are starting to shift the latitudes that they occupy to stay in their preferred temperature range. And I've also heard that because the warming tends to be slowing down the interchange of water from the deeper parts to the surface, that plankton are not getting as much nutrient bathing as they used to get in some pretty big areas, and the populations are generally declining. That's a new thing I just heard. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but it's certainly not great news to hear. Yeah.
No, excuse me.
What about shifting ocean currents? What can you say about that?
Shifting ocean currents. Well, there's this theoretical idea that if the Arctic melts quickly and a lot of cold, fresh water comes pouring down south, that the sinking of the water from the Gulf Stream will be slowed down. It'll sort of back up and slow down, and that will affect the climate. It seems like the data on that are mixed. Whether that's really happened or happening seems to be mixed. So I'm really hoping it's not happening, and I'm going to stick with that until I get convinced that it is, which is sort of my whole history is that all these things I was always hoping I was wrong about them, that they weren't really happening, but a lot of them turned out to be happening.
Please, I'm serious. Come to the aisle. We'll save a little time that way if you have a question.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering, do you think there's any laws that you think should be passed that would really help the ocean currently?
Well, I really think that we need to do a lot about energy, and that can be really that can be legislated. The vast central areas of the ocean are still pretty much a free-for-all. We need to enclose them in the rule of law. We've been trying to do some of that with these international fish commissions, which mainly don't work. They mainly don't work because there's no system of checks and balances that says, if you don't perform well and if the fish stocks go down, then we'll give the job to somebody else, or this body will be disbanded, or another one will come in and supersede. So there are lots of things like that that I think really need to be done. There have been some really good things done, like the laws that I showed that protect the turtles from the nets. The drift net ban in the 1980s, there were thousands and thousands of miles of netting in the ocean every night. The UN enacted a ban. It's kind of hard to imagine the UN could really do something, because for a long time they haven't really been able to, but they enacted a ban and it has held. So there have been some good things done that have had a lot to do with people getting together under the idea of the rule of law, but there is really, really, really a long way to go. Anybody else? Yes, up in the back.
Have any of the Western religions done anything actively to help out with all this that you said you were working with before?
Well, yes. I mean, they've really done a lot, but it tends to be kind of piecemeal. Different religions and different groups are doing different things in different ways. It's not like Christianity is doing this and Islam is doing that. It's like, one sect in this region is taking this on, or one megachurch is doing this project with people in Nicaragua, or something along those lines. So it's actually I don't know of anything that's tried to gather it all up together. My sense is there's a lot more of it now than there was 10 years ago. And there's certainly a lot less resistance and a lot more discussion about it than there was then.
I'm going to ask a question.
Okay?
You took a trip with some people of faith and reached across and saw some complications. And I think many of us here watch television and read the newspapers, and we see lots of people walking around in Revolutionary War hats, others who are senators, many who are selling the same ethic about robbing from the future, except talking about robbing money from the future, as opposed to a larger heritage. And I wonder if you've thought about this, about how one can bridge this gap. It seems to be a gap that is bridgeable intellectually, but certainly not by people's rhetoric. They claim that you couldn't possibly, for example, become an environmentalist because we have to get our money straightened out so that we don't rob our future generations because of deficits and so on. I'm wondering if you know of any actions that, or things you've thought about to bridge that gap.
Well, the really funny thing is that when Bush was president, the right-wing people told me that the deficit is no problem at all. Worrying about the deficit is just for liberal sissies. And now, of course, it's a totally different thing. Now, of course, they wave the flag, oh, the deficit is the worst thing in the world. So I think that that idea is really a nonsensical kind of a thing that's just being promoted by ideologues who are just party loyalists, really. And how you bridge that gap, now is a bad time to bridge that gap, just like 5 years ago was a bad time to try to bridge the gap with the evangelicals on the environment, because they were really closed about it. And right now, this party system that we have is so broken because it's completely polarized. It's just become a team sport where one team has to win at the expense of the other team instead of trying to get together and hash out our disagreements and then vote on things. So it's not a good time right now to do that. I think we just have to wait out some of the incredible polarization, and then when more reasonable voices and more moderate voices start to appear, which I think will happen kind of soon, because this can't last that long, I think. Then I think moderation will go back to being a little bit more in style.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Perhaps this will be the last one because we're getting a little late.
What is the status of the resistance to the Japanese clubbing of seals?
The Japanese are not the people who club the seals. It's mostly Canadians who club the seals. And they club the seals mainly for markets, as I understand, in China, actually. But Japan right now is trying to overturn and undo the ban on whaling that was enacted in 1986. And Japan was leading the defeat of these proposals to ban the trade in shark fins, really depleted species of sharks, and in this rapidly declining population of bluefin tuna. So Japan is a very strange case because they are the most westernized country in Asia. They seem to embrace all things Western. They go to work in Western suits, they listen to jazz and watch baseball and ride trains and all this kind of stuff. And yet we don't seem to be able to bridge this gap on a Western ethic of conservation, which really, there's nothing that Western about it. Baseball is a lot more Western, and jazz is a lot more Western, believe me, than the idea that if you really like something, you should take care of it so that it doesn't go away. But this seems to be a wall right now, and my hope is that in another generation, that wall will erode. If you think about American attitudes toward the environment, let's say in the 1960s, in this country, there was no Clean Air Act, no Endangered Species Act, no Clean Water Act, no Toxic Substances Control Act. There was DDT and pesticides on everybody's lawn and all that kind of stuff. So maybe in another generation, it'll be a different Japan. And, you know, that's what I hope will happen with writing books and talking and that kind of stuff. I think that an exchange of ideas may begin to take hold, because Lord knows they've embraced all these other ideas. So it may just be that an old guard has to die out. Young people in Japan, they don't care about whaling. And the other things have been very, very mischaracterized over there, like this is a big attack on the sushi culture if you ban the sale of bluefin tuna from the North Atlantic. And nobody was saying that. They could eat all the sushi that they wanted. They could eat all the bluefin tuna that they wanted, but just not the ones from the North Atlantic. That was the only proposal. And they made it sound like, oh, we're destroying the Japanese culture. I have a very different take on it, because I grew up in a place with no sushi restaurants and loads of bluefin tuna off the coast here. Now we have loads of sushi restaurants and no bluefin tuna. And why? Because all those tuna got flown to Japan. They came to my ocean, wrecked my fish, and then accused me of attacking their sushi culture. So it's a bunch of nonsense, really. It's just not the way it really is.
Well, if there were any who didn't already know how lucky we are to have such a person in our community to bring all these wonderful ideas on the wings of an albatross, let's thank Carl Safina.
Thank you very much. Thank you.